In our episodes, we discuss cases and topics that might be distressing or disturbing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode. The case we are going to cover today is tragic in so many ways, and I think mostly because it was entirely preventable. In 2001, the world was stunned and horrified as news came out that a Texas mother had drowned her 5 children. Photos of Andrea Yates, photos of her and her children, and what many considered to be a picture-perfect family were plastered all over the media. This case was incredibly high-profile and controversial, but prompted many incredibly important conversations on insanity pleas, postpartum depression, anxiety, and particularly postpartum psychosis. It also generated conversations on the extraordinarily high societal pressures and expectations placed on mothers, inadequacies in our healthcare system and supports for women and mothers, and the role of extreme religious beliefs and how those can exacerbate or add to all of these issues. Now, obviously, we have our standard listener discretion I put at the beginning of each episode. With this one, definitely take extra care as it does involve the deaths of children and extensive discussions of suicide. However, the primary focus of this episode isn't going to be the day Andrea Yates killed her children. We will briefly go over that, but I want to go back and really examine her life and the events leading up to that day. Because there is, I believe, so much we can learn about postpartum psychosis and all of the things that influenced and contributed to the deterioration of her mental state. I initially did research on Andrea Yates during my master's degree, and I knew the basics of her case, but when I learned more about who she was as a person, the person she became, and specifically her mental decline and the number of missed opportunities to help her, it truly broke my heart. So many systems and people failed her. Her kids should be here today. And they aren't because she didn't get the help she needed for the clear problems she had. We are going to go over all of it. We will then talk about the 2 trials she had, some of the primary arguments made, and then close with where Andrea Yates is now, and some more recent cases that have reminded me of hers. Let's get started. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, 911 operators in Clear Lake, Texas received a call. The operator asks the caller what their name is, and the caller says Andrea Yates. The operator repeatedly asks Andrea what the problem is, but she won't answer. Instead, she just keeps insisting that they need to come. The operator says they need to know why they're coming, and asks, "Are you having a disturbance? Are you ill?" Andrea replies, "Yes, I'm ill." The operator asks if she needs an ambulance, and Andrea responds, quote, "No, I need a police officer." "Yeah, send an ambulance." Now, Andrea, throughout the call, refuses to tell the operator what's going on, and she's speaking in a calm manner, but she's breathing heavily. Andrea confirms to the operator that she's alone and her husband isn't home. When police and first responders arrive, Andrea Yates tells them she just drowned her children. She was fully cooperative with police, who sat her down on the couch in her home until they eventually brought her to the Houston Police Department's Homicide Division for an interview. Now, in this initial interview, which lasted only 18 minutes, Andrea Yates waived her rights to remain silent and her right to have a lawyer present. During this interview, she fully confesses and tells the officer what happened. The interview opens with the officer informing her of her rights. They talk about her and her marriage to her husband, Rusty, who works at NASA. They talk about how long they've been married, if he was a good father, to which she said yes. The officer asked about her education, where she went to high school, and how she stopped working full-time after she had her first child. The officer then transitions and asks her to detail what happened that morning. Andrea said she woke up and got out of bed that morning at 8:10 a.m., and that at the time, Rusty and 3 of her kids were awake. She said they were eating cereal, and eventually Rusty left for work. As soon as Rusty left for work, Andrea proceeded to fill up their master bathroom bathtub almost to the top. She then called her kids in one by one and drowned them. Paul was 3, Luke was 2, John was 5, Mary was 6 months old, and her oldest son Noah was 7 years old. She put Paul, Luke, John, and Mary in the bedroom and covered them up with a blanket. Noah was left in the bathtub. That's when she called police. She told the officers after calling police she called her husband Rusty and told him to come home. Rusty asked Andrea what was wrong, and she just said, "It's time." Now, Andrea gave some initial context for her reasoning as to why she did this, and also provided a glimpse into the issues she'd been having. The officer, before Andrea detailed the drowning of her children, asked her why she wanted to drown them. And after 15 seconds of no response, he added, quote, Was it in reference to, or was it because the children had done something? Andrea said no. The officer said, "You weren't mad at the children?" Andrea said no. The officer says, "Okay, you had thought of this prior to this day?" Andrea said yes. The officer asked her how long she'd been having thoughts about drowning her children. Andrea said, quote, "Probably since I realized I have not been a good mother to them." Now, the officer asks her what makes her say that she hadn't been a good mother to them. And she said they weren't developing correctly, that they had behavioral and learning problems. Later on in the interview, they briefly talk about previous thoughts she had of drowning her kids. She said she'd been having these thoughts of harming her kids for up to 2 years. And she said around that time she realized it was time for her to be punished for not being a good mother. Andrea said she saw drowning her kids and the subsequent punishment from the criminal justice system as the way she would be punished for her belief that she was a bad mother. She also told police that just 2 months prior, she had filled up her bathtub with plans to do it then, but ended up not going through with it. So how does she get to this point? Let's start from the beginning. Let's look at her childhood, her marriage, her life up until she killed her children, just to see the various factors that might have influenced her. Now, when looking at her upbringing and childhood, there really isn't anything that stands out that would indicate future problems. She was the valedictorian of her high school class, captain of her swim team, and the president of the National Honor Society. She went on to achieve a higher education, and she worked as a nurse until she resigned to take care of her children with her husband she had married years prior. Andrea met Rusty in 1989 at the apartment complex they both lived in. And Andrea was actually the one to approach Rusty first, which was apparently a pretty bold move for her. She hadn't dated anyone until she was 23 years old, and she met Rusty when she was 25. Rusty was described as a, quote, popular jock in high school, and at the time he met Andrea, he was designing computer systems for NASA. The two dated and got married on April 17th, 1993. During their years of dating, according to an article published by Deborah Deno in the Duke Journal of Gender Law and Policy, they were, quote, living together, reading the Bible, and praying. Their religion plays a big role in this story, and the role religion would play in their lives was pretty clear right from the beginning. At their wedding ceremony, the two apparently announced to wedding guests that they would not be using birth control, as they wanted as many children as possible. And within 3 months, Andrea was pregnant with the first of their 5 children. Now, Andrea Yates herself has never been critical of her husband, but one of Andrea's friends described him as, quote, controlling, critical, and demanding. And it really seems as though both Rusty, his religious beliefs, and those beliefs and the religious role he expected Andrea to adhere to greatly impacted her. Andrea's own mother and her friend said that Andrea lost her identity after she married Rusty, that it was Rusty's desire to plan to have a large family, and that Andrea was determined to be a, quote, supermom. And witnesses in her trials all agreed she was a fantastic mother. She homeschooled them, she did crafts with them, played with them, all of it. But when you look beyond at this idyllic version of this mother she was trying to meet and what that meant to her, you can see how it quickly became dangerous and impacted her mental health. Now, before we jump into the birth of the Yates children and before we chronicle her spiraling mental health, let's talk about their religion, because I believe it greatly informed the delusions that Andrea Yates would come to have, and I think it directly played a role in why she believed she was a bad mother. More specifically, I believe the issue was the pastor the two were extremely close with. This was a pastor who advised them. The influence the pastor and his wife had on Andrea Yates was so great that a psychiatrist on her defense team said he is confident she never would have drowned her children if it were not for this man, Michael Warnecki. Michael was brought into their lives because of Andrea's husband, Rusty. Rusty had actually met Michael while he was a student at Auburn University in Alabama. Michael was going around to college campuses, recruiting new followers, and Rusty was one of them. Later on, Rusty introduced Michael to Andrea. The two not only followed Michael's religious teachings, but they really wanted to model their own lifestyle after his. Michael and his wife had 6 children and at a certain point lived on a bus for some reason. The Yates also went on to have 5 children, and for a certain time they also lived on a bus that they bought from Michael, and we'll get into that more later. But what religion was Michael exactly falling under? Andrea herself was raised as a Roman Catholic, and Rusty was raised as a Methodist. But they both abandoned organized religion for what Michael Warnecki was offering, which was this kind of non-denominational, fundamentalist type of Christianity. They didn't go to a church, but instead hosted a Bible study group at their house 3 times a week. The sermons and the things that Michael was preaching, though, to me, were very dark. He would make these bold proclamations that the world was going to hell, that hell was on your doorstep waiting to bring you in, and that parents were responsible for the salvation of their children so they wouldn't, quote, perish in hellfire. He also allegedly said that parents should commit suicide rather than cause their children to stumble and go to hell. Now, Michael, who still, to this day, travels around and preaches, says he shouldn't be blamed for what happened to the Yates children. In an interview with ABC News, he said, yeah, he told the Yates that they were going to hell during a visit they had in 1998. But he said, quote, of course, because everybody's going to hell. He added that he doesn't think his preaching against Satan and hell sent Andrea over the edge. He said, quote, I shared Jesus with them. And he apparently warned Rusty over and over again that Andrea and the children were in need of his love. He then says, quote, I hold him responsible for the drownings, but I also hold Andrea responsible. Now, to me, this is giving major cult vibes. And I don't want to offend or disparage anyone of their religious beliefs, right? Like, you do you. But to me, when I'm reading that this man was preaching that parents should commit suicide rather than have their kids stumble, preaching about Satan and saying everyone's going to hell, and that he warned the Yates family over and over again that they needed him, Michael, to save them, that what, to not have your kids stumble, you need to listen to Michael? To me, that is a huge red flag. Andrea also specifically said that she killed her kids to save them from going to hell. She said she was a bad mother because they had behavioral issues. And to me, the connection between this and her religion is clear. Her religion and these preachings that they were deep into put a huge emphasis on Satan. They instilled fear into parents, saying that children stumbling would be directly their fault and cause them to go to hell. And what exactly do they mean by stumbling? We will get more into the fears that Andrea had regarding her kids, but the role that their religion played in her mental deterioration is huge, and I really think cannot be ignored. Now, let's go over Andrea's mental health issues. There were many, many problems, And some believe that Andrea could have had depression before she started having kids, but we really see problems start after the birth of their first child, Noah. But the issues really spiral out of control in 1999. So let's start with the birth of her first child, Noah, who was born on February 26, 1994. Now, around this time, Andrea had just left her job to be a full-time stay-at-home mother. Shortly after Noah was born, Andrea said she had a vision where an image of a knife turned into a scene of someone being stabbed. But she didn't actually tell anyone about this until after she was arrested. Andrea and Rusty's second child, John, was born on December 15th, 1995. And it seems like around this time, Andrea stopped some of her regular hobbies like swimming and running, and it appears she also stopped socializing with her friends as much. And she gets lonelier. In early 1996, Andrea wrote to Rachel Warnecki, the wife of their pastor, and talked about her loneliness. Rachel allegedly wrote back, apparently telling Andrea to read a chapter of the New Testament that describes the role of women, which is to love their husbands and children, to work at home, and be subject to their husbands. Also, in 1996, Rusty has an opportunity to work on this 6-month project in Florida for NASA. They lease out their home, sell their possessions, and they move into this 38-foot trailer. In September of 1997, their third child, Paul, is born. And there really isn't anything that seems to be going on in 1997. But in 1998, they sell their home that they had been leasing, and they move into a bus that they bought from the Warneckis. So at this point, they have 3 kids and 2 adults sleeping in a bus. And I don't know why they haven't moved back into a house yet, because the Florida NASA gig seems to be over by this point. And it just kind of shows how they're almost seeming to model their life after their pastor's life. He lived on a bus, and now they literally are buying that bus from him. Now we get to February 15th of 1999, and their 4th child, Luke, is born. And there is a lot going on after Luke is born. First, Andrea is helping care for her father, who has Alzheimer's. Family members know around this time that she didn't want anyone to visit them at their bus, that she would rather go and see people at their homes, which I get. Like I said, you now have 4 kids and 2 adults living on a literal bus. So I can't imagine I would want anyone to come over either. But also around this time, neighbors, because they're parking their bus in like a recreational vehicle neighborhood lot thing, say Andrea seems exhausted. And I can imagine she is. She's caring for 4 kids on a bus. But despite this, they still take a trip on this bus to the Grand Canyon and Lake Mead. Andrea at this time is feeling overwhelmed. She's feeling exhausted, but also around this time, it seems as though the delusions and the hallucinations begin. She begins to just know, through a feeling, that Satan wanted her to kill her children. And this really spirals. On June 16th, 1999, Andrea calls Rusty at work and asks him to come home. He gets back to the bus and finds Andrea shaking. She's crying and she's biting her fingers. Rusty takes her on a walk and eventually brings her to her parents' house. The very next day, Andrea attempts to take her own life. She overdoses on her father's prescription medication and is hospitalized for the first time from June 18th to June 24th, 1999. While Andrea is there, she refuses medication, saying she wants to continue to breastfeed. She said she tried to overdose because she wanted to, quote, sleep forever, but that she felt guilty afterwards. She meets with a psychiatrist who finds her, quote, severely depressed and essentially nonverbal. She does eventually start taking Zoloft and stops breastfeeding. During this first hospitalization, Andrea worries about the hospital bill that they'll get. She attends some group meetings, but they don't appear to help. And eventually, Andrea and Rusty meet with the psychiatrist and request that she be discharged. They hope that a home setting might be better for her, and Rusty agrees to provide Andrea with 24-hour supervision. Her discharge papers indicate that Andrea was still, quote, quite depressed, but denied suicidal ideation. And the reason for her release is cited as, quote, insurance restrictions. So it is clear that money and insurance problems were factoring into their decision-making. Interestingly, a social worker at the first hospital stay that she does files a complaint with Child Protective Services based on Rusty apparently allowing his sons to handle power tools. And now this is in 1999, and their oldest son would have only been maybe 6 years old at the time, but nothing ends up coming of that. So Andrea is discharged, but things do not get better at all. She meets with her psychiatrist on July 1st and says the Zoloft is helping a little, but is still anxious. The psychiatrist recommends she switch from Zoloft to Zyprexa, which is an antipsychotic used to treat bipolar mania and schizophrenia. But Andrea apparently flushes those samples down the toilet. From July 2nd to July 19th, 1999, her mental health significantly deteriorates. She stays in bed all day. She scratches and picks at herself so badly that she gets bald patches. She picks at sores she has in her nose. She scrapes up her arms and legs, refuses to feed her children, claiming that they were eating too much. Later on, she says during this time she was having visions and hearing voices, and that those voices were telling her to get a knife. Like what she said she saw after her first child was born, she had visions of people being stabbed. Around this time, Andrea also starts to have these paranoid delusions. She began to believe that there were surveillance cameras in the ceiling and that she was being watched. She also started to believe that characters on television were talking to her. And she told Rusty about these delusions and hallucinations, but neither of them tell the doctors, despite the doctors specifically asking if she was hallucinating. Now, on either July 20th or July 26, 1999, I've seen both of these dates, Andrea attempts to take her own life again. And mind you, this is just a few weeks after her first attempt and after she has been released from the hospital. Andrea is hospitalized again from around July 20th or 26th to August 10th. She barely speaks, she barely responds to anyone, she doesn't want to eat, and she seems frightened of nurses. She won't dress herself. She refuses medications for a time before she eventually agrees to take the Zyprexa. Now, records from her hospitalization here indicate that this suicide attempt was because she was having visions and hearing voices that were telling her to hurt others, and she was afraid that she would act on them. She said she had at least 10 visions over the course of several days. She has a psychosocial interview and said she was angry at herself for not knowing how to go through with the suicide. She said she's been depressed since Noah's birth and that she needs more help from Rusty. Andrea is discharged on August 9th, is on a number of medications, and around this time, they decide that living on the bus isn't a good option. Yeah, I agree. So they get a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home. Over the next few days during various meetings, Andrea says she wants to stop taking medication because it makes her feel like a weak person. Her therapist also notes during a family session that Rusty was pressuring Andrea to stop one of her treatment programs. Rusty said, well, she's 90 to 95% back to normal. But Andrea at the time said she only felt 70 to 75% back to normal. And this is so concerning to me reading this. Not only her belief that taking medication makes her a weak person, to anyone out there on medication, that is not true, but also the influence Rusty has on her, right? And the pressure he puts on her. Now, around this time, the Yates claim that they are going to reduce Andrea's stress by having Rusty's mom help out. Rusty will work half days, but even the therapist is like, okay, but you're still wanting Andrea to homeschool all of these kids, and they want more children. Moreover, on August 19th, during a group therapy session, Andrea says that Russell, quote, permits her a few hours per week to spend as she pleases. Now, the people at the group therapy session encourage her to be more assertive, and she said she wants to learn how to enjoy herself again, but that when she tries to be more communicative and talk to Rusty about this, he just turns the TV on. So it seems like he's just basically ignoring her. Now, Andrea also at this time tells her therapist that she wants to get off medications so she can have more children. And the therapist warns them that this is a terrible idea. The therapist notes literally say, quote, "Apparently, Andrea and husband plan to have as many babies as nature will allow. This will surely guarantee future psychotic depression." But a few months later, in October, Andrea and Russell tell the doctor that because of insurance problems, she isn't taking some of her medications, but that she feels like she's doing better. And apparently, in December of 1999, things really do start to improve for Andrea. She was swimming, baking, and sewing, playing with her kids, and she reportedly told Russell that she, quote, failed at their life in the bus, but that this new phase in their home is like a fresh start for them. In January of the year 2000, Andrea admits that she's stopped taking her medications, but she's doing fine. And just a couple months later, in March, she learns she's pregnant with their fifth and final child. And her doctor is very, very concerned because, one, she's not taking her medications, but she's also now pregnant again, which she specifically warned them against. But the year 2000 doesn't have a lot of significant events that I could find. On November 30th, Mary, their fifth child, is born, and there's nothing in reporting right away, but on March 12th, 2001, so this is just about 3 months before she kills her children, Andrea's father dies. And this is when things very quickly begin to escalate. Immediately following Andrea's father's death, like literally the next day, for the entire rest of the month of March, Andrea just stops talking. She refuses to drink liquids. She again starts scratching and picking at herself and her scalp. She apparently will continuously hold Mary, but won't feed her. On March 31st, Andrea is admitted to a treatment center, which she at first refuses to go to. And one of the doctors actually starts the process to have her admitted against her will, but eventually Rusty is able to convince her to go voluntarily. Now, she meets with a new doctor named Dr. Saeed, who describes her at the time as being almost catatonic. Andrea is prescribed medication once again. She gets back into group therapy, and based on some notes, it's kind of back and forth on whether she's eating or not eating. There's really not a lot of information on how she's doing, but on the 12th, she's actually discharged from inpatient care and begins this partial hospitalization. So she's required to be at the hospital during the day, but she can go and be home at night. And Andrea does this for 1 day and refuses to go again, which Rusty supports. On April 18th, though, she is completely discharged because Dr. Saeed apparently felt that Rusty could take care of her. But shortly after, on May 3rd, 2001, while Rusty is at work, Noah, their oldest child, sees Andrea filling the bathtub with water. Noah tells Rusty's mom, who is visiting and helping out, and Rusty's mom asks Andrea why she's filling up the tub, and Andrea just says, quote, "just in case I need it." And if you remember during the interview she had with police, she said there was another time before the day she killed her kids that she planned to do it, but didn't. This was likely that day. Now, later that day on the 3rd, Andrea refuses to let one of her friends in the house. So things are obviously getting worse, like there's something wrong. And so Andrea is brought back to the hospital the next day because she's, again, not eating, she's not drinking, but she's not claiming to be suicidal. Andrea is readmitted and she begins taking Haldol, which is a medication that's brought up a lot for her. And it seems like at this time they're kind of going through treatment options for her. And one of the doctors brings up electroshock therapy, which to me seemed very old-fashioned, but I briefly looked into it. It sounds like it is something that people will do for postpartum psychosis, but Rusty refuses to consider it. Now, on May 6th, Dr. Saeed reviews Andrea's medical records from her visits to other hospitals, which I don't know why that isn't just standard. Apparently, Rusty had to, beg the doctor to review her records for some reason. I don't know. But Andrea's in the hospital until May 14th, and during this time, she is completely unresponsive. She isolates herself. She doesn't seem happy when her kids visit. And on May 12th, she does a couples therapy session with Rusty, but apparently neither of them say that they have any issues to discuss. I don't know if that means like they don't have any issues between the two of them relationship-wise, or if they just don't have issues in general. There's clearly issues that they need to discuss. But on the 14th, she is completely discharged. And Russell is apparently stunned that this is happening, as am I, but Andrea tells them she isn't suicidal. So they just apparently think it's okay to have her be discharged. But none of them asked her if she was feeling homicidal. And there is virtually no improvement in the days following her discharge. She apparently just sits in one spot all day and has no emotion. And so again, I do not know why she was discharged this other time. Even Rusty, who had previously encouraged her to stop certain therapies, didn't want her to try the electroshock therapy, seemed to really be influencing her. Even Rusty was stunned that she was being discharged. Now, getting into June, on June 18th specifically, so this is just days before she kills her kids, Andrea and Rusty have a follow-up appointment with Dr. Saeed. And during this appointment, Rusty is apparently unusually concerned about her. He said she's getting worse and he wants her medications looked at. Rusty said that she's having nightmares. But Dr. Saeed allegedly wrote in his notes that Andrea was doing well and actually reduced one of her antidepressants, despite Rusty not wanting to do that. Rusty apparently was pleading with the doctor to put her back on Haldol, which the doctor refused, claiming it was, quote, bad medicine. Now, from what I'm reading, also, Dr. Saeed apparently told Andrea to, quote, focus on positive thoughts and suggest that she sees a psychologist. This is stunning to me. On June 19th, 2001, Andrea watched cartoons in the living room and played basketball with Russell and Noah. But then, without speaking, she apparently got into bed without changing her clothes and slept until the next morning, June 20th, the morning she drowned all of her kids. In the 5 weeks before she killed her children, between her being discharged from the hospital on the 12th until June 20th, she has hallucinations and visions that she isn't telling anyone. She thought television commercials for candy were referring to her. She thought one commercial specifically was calling her a fat pig and telling her that she gave her kids too much candy. We talked about how she previously believed that cameras were installed in her home to watch her. She now also started believing that her mother-in-law was part of it and that there was a camera in her glasses. She apparently at one point saw a van near her home and thought her home was bugged. And ultimately, she believed Satan was within her and that Satan was there for her kids because they, quote, weren't developing correctly and weren't righteous. Andrea thought because her kids had poor manners that she had ruined them. She thought her son Luke would become a, quote, mute homosexual prostitute and that John would become a serial killer. She apparently had visions of Noah dying a tragic death and Paul being hit by a truck. She was fully convinced, through her delusions, that her kids were going to be punished by Satan and that they would burn in hell. She had a fixation on the Bible verse, Luke 17:2, which, if you remember, was reported as an example of one of the verses their pastors would teach them. And this verse says, quote, "It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown in the sea than that he should cause one of the little ones to stumble." Now, just to briefly go over some aspects of the trial, the defense was pushing that Andrea was not guilty by reason of insanity, and the prosecution was claiming that she was legally sane under Texas law. So, Andrea Yates had two trials. During the first trial, there was controversial testimony from a Dr. Dietz, who was a psychiatric expert with the prosecution. Now, I've seen a lot of criticism on his testimony and his experience, mainly that he demonstrated that he was not very familiar with postpartum psychosis specifically, which is obviously a problem in this case. But also, during cross-examination, he was asked about whether or not he was a script consultant for TV shows, which he was. He did script consulting for Law & Order. But he apparently testified that shortly before Andrea killed her children, an episode of Law & Order aired where a postpartum depressed mother successfully won an insanity appeal after drowning her children in a bathtub. And this, for one, is ridiculous to me, to insinuate that, one, Andrea ever wanted to win an insanity plea, because Andrea Yates, from everything I read, never wanted to go through with the insanity plea. She wanted the death penalty. That was the entire point, she claimed, of drowning her children. The punishment for her being a bad mother would be for her to get the death penalty. She was clear. She literally wanted to be executed. But what Dietz said about this apparent Law & Order episode was used again by the prosecutor during cross-examination of a defense psychiatrist, and he used it again in closing arguments. So after this first trial, the jury finds her guilty. So the insanity plea in this first trial does not work. At a certain point after that verdict was read, after she's found guilty, Dietz realizes that he was mistaken. There actually wasn't an episode like what he described about a woman successfully winning an insanity plea, right? So he tells someone of that mistake. Her attorneys appeal, and she gets a new trial. And that false testimony, I believe, was really important in that appeal. They believe that that bit of him testifying about that Law & Order episode was something that really influenced the jury. Either way, right? She gets a new trial. I will say, though, before I move on to the second trial, that trial was death qualified because the state was seeking the death penalty. And there are differences in how you can pick your jury when you're looking at a non-death qualified one and a death qualified one. Now, death qualified juries tend to be more conservative, and the jury was selected from Harris County, Texas, which is a more conservative county. I saw in my research, and this might be a little outdated, that apparently Harris County puts more people on death row than all but 2 states in the U.S. With that first trial, the jury had 10 voting in favor of guilty and 2 who voted not guilty by reason of insanity. They deliberated for 3.5 hours and found her guilty. From what I'm seeing now, Texas does require a unanimous vote from the jury. So my guess is that the 2 who initially voted not guilty by reason of insanity were apparently at some point swayed during jury deliberations. So they vote guilty, but then it took them only 30 minutes to reject the death penalty. So Andrea Yates was sentenced to life in prison that first round. But like I said, she appealed. She gets a second trial. Now, in the second trial, the prosecution has to repitch their case. And I think it seems like Dr. Dietz still testified again for them. They obviously are not bringing up that Law & Order episode that he falsely believed was a thing. But the prosecution wanted to show that she pre-planned this event and that she knew right from wrong. And they did this by emphasizing that she waited for Rusty to leave the house and that she called 911 because she knew she'd be punished. To them, this shows that she knew right from wrong. They wanted to show that she was acting on, quote, misguided beliefs, but not insanity, that she understood the consequences of her actions. Now, there's a really great article published in the Cleveland State Law Review by Philip Resnick, who was the primary forensic psychiatrist on the defense team. In it, he gives a great overview of her psychiatric history, her account of the homicides, and he also lays out the differences in how he and Dr. Dietz approached Andrea's mental health. Now, I've used this article a lot for this episode, and you can find all of my sources in the show notes if you're interested in this case. I highly recommend you read it, but I want to note just a few things. In this article, Dr. Resnick writes, quote, Dr. Dietz and I agreed on 3 central issues. 1. Mrs. Yates had a severe mental disease on June 20th, 2001 when she drowned her children. 2, they agreed that Mrs. Yates knew that drowning her children was against the law. And 3, they both agreed that Mrs. Yates believed that killing her children was in their best interest. So Dr. Resnick's diagnosis of Andrea was that she suffered from a psychosis schizoaffective disorder. This was based on major depressive episodes she had, auditory and visual hallucinations, and paranoid delusions. In contrast, Dr. Dietz didn't have a specific diagnosis for Andrea, but did agree that she had a severe mental disease at the time. Now, Resnick and Dietz agreed that Yates knew that killing her kids was against the law, and she demonstrated this by waiting until she was alone, because she knew her husband wouldn't approve and would try to stop her, and she called the police because she expected to be arrested and eventually executed, right? So it's clear she knew what she was doing was against the law. But I'm going to read again from this article. Resnick then writes, although Dr. Dietz conceded that Mrs. Yates took her children's lives because she believed she was acting in their best interest, he nonetheless concluded with reasonable medical certainty that Mrs. Yates knew that her conduct was wrong in the eyes of the law, society, and God. It was my opinion that Mrs. Yates did not know the wrongfulness of her homicidal conduct due to her severe mental disease. My opinion was based on the following evidence. Mrs. Yates believed it was right to drown her children because she held a delusional belief that her children were not being raised righteously and that they would burn in hell if she didn't take their own lives. She faced a psychotic dilemma. She thought that she was doing what was right for her children by arranging for them to go to heaven while they were still innocent. She stated, quote, they had to die to be saved. 2. Mrs. Yates loved her children so much that she was not deterred from saving her children's souls by the fact that she expected to be executed by the state of Texas. She believed that because the one and only Satan was within her, that Satan would be executed along with her. 3. Mrs. Yates did not kill her children in 1999 in spite of command hallucinations to do so because she believed it was not in her children's best interest to die at the time. When she heard the, quote, voice of Satan instructing her to stab her children in 1999, she instead twice attempted suicide rather than risk harming her children. It was only when her psychosis recurred in 2001 that she came to delusionally believe that it was in her children's best interest to die. Only then did she take their lives to, quote, save their souls. 4. Mrs. Yates made no effort to hide her crime. Her delusional belief that TV cameras were monitoring her did not stop her from killing her children in their home. Immediately after the killing, she called police, remained at the crime scene, and requested to be punished. And 5. Mrs. Yates had no alternative motive to take the lives of her children other than the psychotic belief that she was saving their souls. She was a devoted mother. Resnick writes, finally, I reminded the jury of the psychotic dilemma that Mrs. Yates faced at the time she drowned her children. She believed that if she did not act, her children would burn in hell for all eternity. If she did take their lives before the age of accountability, her children would be with God in heaven for all eternity. Mrs. Yates believed that taking her children's lives was the right thing to do in the face of this dilemma. So that just kind of shows a little bit of how the defense was presenting her psychosis. And ultimately, in the second trial, Andrea Yates was found not guilty by reason of insanity. And this, in my opinion, is the absolute right call. I think it is clear she was in psychosis at the time she killed her kids. And I also want to say, there is a huge misconception about the use of the insanity plea. An insanity plea doesn't mean that this person is then just free to live their life. In fact, to quote an article published in the Cornell Journal of Law and Public Policy, being found not guilty by reason of insanity can yield a punishment even greater than a guilty verdict. This article says, quote, once found not guilty by reason of insanity, they may not simply go home or obtain treatment on their own accord. Rather, they are usually involuntarily and indefinitely committed to a state psychiatric facility. It says those who are found not guilty by reason of insanity have been found to be held in confinement as long or significantly longer than those convicted of the same crime. Now, Andrea Yates is currently living in the Kerrville State Hospital in Texas and continues to receive care. Her defense attorney, George Parnham, stated in an ABC 13 Houston interview in 2018 that he visits her often and believes she's improved with her treatment over the years. He said their conversations are normal, logical, rational, and that she shows remorse. He said, quote, "She's obviously very aware and is impacted tremendously by what happened." Parnham says Yates makes artwork, and the money she makes from selling it to individuals who are likely not aware it's from her is sent to his office and placed in a memorial fund that assists in screening low-income women for mental health issues. Because of the not guilty by reason of insanity verdict in her case, the court has jurisdiction over her for as long as her sentence would have been, which in this case is life. Parnham says that Yates has waived her appearance for a review of her case every year. Passing that review is the only way she could ever be released. Now, there's a similar case, a little more recent, in Massachusetts, where another mother, also struggling with extreme postpartum illness and delusions, allegedly killed her 3 kids and then was severely injured when she attempted to take her own life. The details are eerily similar. The woman also claimed she had been hallucinating and hearing voices that told her to kill herself and the kids. She was also reportedly hospitalized less than a month before the incident and was on 13 psychiatric drugs over 4 months, but fewer in the days leading up to the killings. Now, despite it being over 2 decades from when Andrea Yates killed her kids, I still think we have miles to go before we as a society are equipped to deal with postpartum psychosis, right? There's still research ongoing into it, but there's just a lot that needs to be learned about risk factors and who is more susceptible. But just speaking from my own experience being a mother, I do not think postpartum psychosis and even more conditions like postpartum depression and anxiety are talked about enough. I had postpartum depression, and sure, you have your few appointments after you give birth, but I don't recall ever really having the symptoms explained to me. I didn't know what to look out for, and many still dismiss postpartum depression as the, quote, baby blues. And then there are just obvious problems with our healthcare system. I think of the many people who are uninsured, who can't afford checkups, so just try to deal with this all on their own. I think of how our country has no guaranteed paid maternity leave. I know mothers who had to go back to work just weeks after giving birth because they couldn't afford not to, and their job didn't offer any sort of leave. I was looking at some other countries and programs they have for postpartum care and supports for new families, and this is some of what I found. In the Netherlands, they have a professional who will come visit you every day following the birth for 8 to 10 days. They do medical checkups for the mother and the baby. They help with breastfeeding or bottle feeding. They help the entire family adjust to having a new baby, including teaching other family members how to change diapers. And it even says they can help you with household chores like laundry, cooking, cleaning, grocery shopping. That is incredible. And the Netherlands, based on my quick look, doesn't have a government-run universal healthcare program, but they mandate you purchase private health insurance and then help individuals who can't afford the premiums. And your healthcare plan determines how much of this type of service would be covered, right? But I think of how Andrea Yates said she needed more help with the kids. She needed more help from Rusty. She had 5 kids, and while she had most of their kids, she was literally caring for them on a bus. I was looking at Sweden, who has a generous paid maternity leave program, and there was actually a study done on mothers in Sweden, and its findings suggested that when mothers have access to parental leave and more parental supports, they had significantly better health outcomes. What a shocker. In Sweden, a family gets 480 days of paid parental leave when a child is born or adopted. Parents can split this. It says you can also transfer up to 45 days of that leave to a grandparent or a family friend, so they can be paid to help with the child. And it says the amount that you get paid for this paid leave is based on your income. It says it's up to 80% of your salary is what you would get. And in Finland, I thought this was really cool. There is a program where every expectant parent receives a box from the government, and this box can be used as a crib. It's like a cute little crate with cute designs on it, and it comes with clothes, sheets, toys, a sleeping bag, bathing products, diapers. And this is a program that was started in the 1930s. And it was designed to ensure that every baby, no matter the income of the family it's being born into, has an equal start. I cannot imagine how incredible that would be for lower income families. I mean, cribs are not cheap, right? Finland also has a national health insurance system, and research absolutely shows that universal healthcare is associated with better health outcomes. Think of Andrea Yates. I'm not saying here that like a baby box like in Finland would have helped her, but think of the times that they requested she be discharged or that she ceased treatment because of the insurance problems she was having. They had to move certain hospitals because her insurance wouldn't cover it. They're making these really important healthcare decisions based on what they can afford and based on what their insurance will allow. That to me is unacceptable. There is so much more that can be done. And while postpartum psychosis is definitely rare, improving access to mental health care, improving postpartum care for new mothers and children, improving access to just healthcare in general will have far-reaching impacts on health overall. I am a big proponent of universal healthcare and strong social programs because, one, I just think it's the right thing to do, and I would prefer my tax dollars go towards helping others, and because studies consistently show that strong social safety programs are linked to decreases in crime rates. So that is something I would like you to consider as we close out this episode. Like I said, this case is so tragic to me. I truly believe there were so many opportunities where she should have gotten better care. She never should have been discharged from the hospital in those months before she killed her kids. She never should have been left alone with them. She needed so much more help than what she got. But let me know what you think about this case, and we will see you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cardinal Crimes. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, giving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast, and sharing this episode with others. You can find us on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram with the handle @CardinalCrimes, and you can send us any case suggestions, questions, or topics you would like covered there or to our email, cardinalcrimes@gmail.com. Until next time, friends, take care of each other and take care of yourself. If you've ever thought about starting your own podcast, there's no better place to begin than with Buzzsprout. It's the platform I use, and it makes publishing, promoting, and tracking your episodes so easy, even if you're not tech savvy. Plus, they help you get listed in all the major directories like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. And here's the best part. When you sign up for a paid Buzzsprout plan using my affiliate link, you'll get $20 off, and you'll be supporting the show at the same time. Just head to the description of this episode to find the affiliate link. Now, let's get back to the episode.